Let me thank you for the opportunity to be with you these 2 days. The music has been worth the trip from North Carolina. I'm glad I wore my bow tie today with everybody dressing up. It was really quite wonderful. And thank you for your fine hospitality and for the opportunity to have a chance to talk with many of you and to be in a class. And it's a most impressive community of faith and learning. And I'm honored to be here. In slavery time, Sojourner Truth dreamed of freedom, not simply for herself, but for her people. Freed in New York in 1827, she fought slavery as a national affliction. She sang out liberation in words of her own composing. Read those together, would you? Even when dismissed as merely a woman, she would not be silent. At one meeting, a man rose and denounced her for her radical abolitionist opinions and her presumption at speaking at a gathering where men were present. "Old woman," he declared, "do you think your talk of slavery does any good? Do you suppose people care what you say? Why, I don't care any more for your talk than I do for the bite of a flea." "Perhaps not," Sojourner Truth replied. "But God willing, I'll keep you scratching." Harriet Tubman dreamed of freedom. At 25, she escaped slavery in Maryland, declaring, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now that I was free. There were two things I had a right to," she reasoned: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. Not content with her own freedom, Tubman made 19 trips back to the South and brought more than 300 slave brothers and sisters to freedom. Other slaves struck blows for freedom even as it was denied them. In his book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, Leon Litwack tells of a slave woman who cooked in the big house of a southern plantation. After emancipation, she reported, and you should read this. Well, you should. There it is. Read that. That woman talked free, didn't she? There's a great story. I'll digress a bit. 1804, the Forks of Elkhorn Baptist Church, a slave woman named Winnie was disciplined by that church for saying she once thought it her requirement to serve her mistress and her master, but since the Lord had converted her, since her baptism, she had believed that no person could keep slaves. She got in more trouble with the church for adding, and this is in the church minutes, that there was, quote, thousands of white people wallowing in hell for their treatment of slaves, and she did not care if many more went there. That woman talked free, too, didn't she? Even while a slave. In distinct and powerful ways, those four women made their own strides toward freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. did too. In 1954, when, with a new Boston University PhD in hand, he became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, just before the Montgomery bus boycott began shaking the foundations of the Jim Crow South. In his book, Stride Toward Freedom, King describes that boycott and his participation in it with a legacy stretching back to Jesus and the words of Jesus' first sermon in his home synagogue in Nazareth. The text is taken from Isaiah chapter 61, and it reads like this. Read those italicized verses from Luke chapter 4. Like Jesus returned to Nazareth, Martin Luther King came home to the South from Boston University to Montgomery, Alabama, the first capital of the Confederate States of America. He came to declare the Word of God, and in ways he could never have imagined, he was called to let the broken victim go free, as tangibly as a bus ride to work. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist preacher, born into a family of Baptist preachers. His father, M.L. King Sr., was longtime pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta, and the son would follow the father there. His mother, Alberta Williams King, was organist at the Ebenezer Church, where she was shot dead by a deranged gunman as she sat at the organ on a Sunday in 1972. Long ago, I decided if I was going to talk publicly about Martin Luther King, I would always remind people that his mother died a martyr's death as well, a fact that is often forgotten by black and white alike. The baptistification of Africans began in camp meetings and revival services throughout the South. In the late 18th and certainly early 19th centuries, blacks and whites worshiped together in the 19th century camp meetings and brush arbors all across the South. They were members of the same Baptist and Methodist churches, often with slaves segregated in galleries in the back or the balconies of the churches. Yet amid bondage, slaves heard the words of salvation and promise in liberation. In the book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made, Eugene Genovese described the underground hush arbors where blacks met secretly to declare that liberation for themselves at worship. He writes, "The meetings gave slaves strength derived from direct contact with God and each other. When not monitored, they allowed the message of promise of deliverance to be heard." Although slaveholders used the New Testament to promote submission, the gospel of liberation was not lost on the slaves themselves. Conversion brought not easy subservience, but the promise of freedom. But liberation and freedom are infuriating, at least for some people. That day in Nazareth, the folks who heard Jesus preach that first sermon, who loved him the most, but understood him the least, were, quote, astonished that words of such grace could fall from his lips. Yet, as today's text extends, by the end of his sermon, the text says, his words roused the whole congregation to fury. They leapt up, drove him out of town, took him to the brow of the hill on which it was built, meaning to hurl him over the edge. But he walked straight through the whole crowd and went away. Why were they so angry? The people who knew him the longest and understood him the least. Because in his first sermon, Jesus of Nazareth talked about race. In that first sermon, he dealt with racial issues center square. He says, "A famine swept the land, and many Israelite widows were starving, but the prophet went only to the non-Jewish widow." And then, adding insult to his hearers' injury, he reminds them that there were many lepers in Israel, but the prophet was sent to heal Naaman the Syrian. Jesus tells the home folk that sometimes God chooses the unexpected ones, the ones who seem far off from cultural and religious privilege. He keeps talking like that, all the way to Golgotha. Martin Luther King did too. Not long after his arrival in Montgomery, a Methodist woman, named Rosa Parks, was arrested for refusing to move to the proper seating place, the rear of the city bus, as was required of passengers of color in the Jim Crow South. From Parks' action, the Montgomery bus boycott began a year-long refusal of black citizens to ride city buses. The economic crisis it created broke the back of segregated transportation in one of the South's most segregated cities and spread widely, including to Birmingham, Alabama, with a fury. King and the Dexter Avenue Church were at the center of that historic movement. Using the phrase, "somewhere I read," King took the Bible, the Holy Bible, the King James Version of the Bible, so we know he was right, and the U.S. Constitution, and turned up the heat on racism and segregation. He challenged America to rise up and live out the calling of its most basic creed, that all men, and he would add now, women, were created equal. And he would not be silent. Many Southern leaders, both black and white, fretted, if King would just keep quiet, we could settle this racial unrest. He's pushing too hard. In the South, these things take time. He is an embarrassment. Strange, isn't it? Sometimes the only way to awaken us to our racism is to humiliate the hell out of it. Speaking theologically, of course. How often in the church's history do we realize after the fact that the people we thought were embarrassments were actually sacred embarrassments? They spoke out, spoke up, pushed the envelope, and in the end, we recognize that they are voices of both judgment and grace, often after we've killed them off. Sacred embarrassments. White Southern Baptists are a case in point. Some Southern Baptist churches in those years developed their own bylaws for keeping African Americans from walking the aisle and seeking membership in their congregations. At the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Louisville, Kentucky, in 1961, and Wake Forest University, where I'm teaching these days, in 1962, donors were so embarrassed and infuriated by King's presence in the chapels of those two Southern Baptist-related institutions that they refused to give money to the seminary anymore. Administrators estimated that both schools lost in the neighborhood of $250,000 each, a tidy sum now, but a fortune in the 1960s. Today, remembering that, let us say it was money well spent. And sometimes even prophets get surprised by freedom. When he went to Dexter Avenue Church, I don't think King had the faintest idea that NAACP practitioner Rosa Parks' refusal to relinquish her place on a Montgomery City bus that December day would begin a local boycott that became a national movement. He says he didn't. Sometimes strides toward freedom begin with tiny steps. They often require dangerous risks that push us into places we hesitate to go or run from like the plague. King's decision to accept leadership of a burgeoning movement was not without struggle. In one of the most famous passages of Stride Toward Freedom, he describes such a terrible moment. It began with a late-night phone call and a voice that warned, "We have taken all we want from you. If you aren't out of town in 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out and blow up your house." And King writes a passage that has become one of the most famous passages of not only the civil rights movement, but of the spirituality of that movement. I'm not going to ask you to read it. It's long. I'm going to read it to you, but I want you to see it. And follow along with me. Here's what King wrote. "I hung up, but I could not sleep. It seemed that all my fears had come down on me at once. I had reached a separation point. I got out of bed and began to walk the floor. Finally, I looked in the kitchen and heated up a pot of coffee. I was ready to give up. I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing a coward. In this state of exhaustion, with my courage all but gone, I decided to take my cause to God. With my head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and prayed out loud. The words I spoke to God that midnight are still vivid in my memory. I am here taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I am afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I have come to the point where I cannot face it any longer, not a second more." At that moment, he writes, "I experienced a presence as I have never felt before. It seemed at that moment I could hear an inner voice saying to me, 'Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for the truth, and lo, I will be with you, even unto the end of the world.' I heard the voice of Jesus saying, 'Still to fight on.' He promised never to leave me alone." So he went on through the boycott to the civil rights demonstration, an unimaginable march on Washington, D.C., dying in Memphis in 1968, shot dead while working on behalf of sanitation workers, black, white, Latino. And the American nation was changed forever. King did not do it alone, of course. Others offered themselves as well. A friend of mine recalls the day he was visiting the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, Alabama, standing in front of the actual jail cell where Martin Luther King was housed and from which he wrote the famous letter from a Birmingham jail to white pastors in the Alabama region. An African-American woman was standing next to him, clasping the hand of a little boy. "Grandma, was this the cell you were in?" the boy asked. "No, honey," she replied. "This was Martin's cell. Mine was up the row a little." Martin Luther King's calling became a new stride toward freedom for men, women, and school children in Birmingham and across the South who were arrested with him, had dogs sicked on them for the sake of freedom and justice and liberation. Why? To let the broken victim go free. Writing in 1923, Walter Rauschenbusch insisted that the essential things, as he talked about the social gospel, the essential thing of God's new day is the projection into the future of the demand for a just social order. Martin Luther King Jr. echoed that when he declared that the arc of the universe leans toward justice. We can only hope. Reverend Dr. Ronald Bobo, one of the first African American students I ever taught, he was here yesterday, longtime pastor of the West Side Baptist Church right here in St. Louis, brought that justice issue home to me 30 years ago when he told me straight up, "You white folks talk like the kingdom of heaven, that great getting up morning, is all eternal bliss, streets of gold and gates of pearl, and not a care in the world. It's different for us black folks. For generations, if you wanted justice in this world, you could hire a lawyer and go to court. We couldn't. So we hoped for justice in the kingdom of God, a time when God would set things right. If not now, then someday." We sang it in our spirituals, he continued, like this: "Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep." In these days of presidential election and rampant rhetoric all around the country, what will we do with Jesus and Martin Luther King and generations of unnamed slaves to let the oppressed go free? King said it. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. That day in the synagogue, Jesus of Nazareth spoke boldly about racial divisions and people on the margins of first century society. Today, even in required chapel, let us join Jesus and Martin Luther King Jr. in working to set at liberty those who are oppressed. And if we've got any guts at all, let's make some noise about it. Shall we? For God's sake. Amen. And so go in peace, and as you are going, know this: by the grace of God you were brought into this world. By the mercy of God you have been sustained to this very moment. And by the love of God fully revealed in Jesus the Christ, you are being redeemed, now and forevermore. Amen. Thank you very much.